The agenda this week revisited the war of words that emerged from the Ottawa Convoy and asked whether global public health institutions failed at the outset of the pandemic. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the war in Ukraine.
These are the most devastating financial sanctions in the history of the world. And I think they took the Russians by surprise because Putin thinks like a gangster. He thinks like a warlord, and he doesn't understand how modern finance works. The idea that you can heap up a pile of gold and then you have your war chest with which to go invade your neighbors, as if this were the Middle Ages, that works anymore. I don't think he understood quite what could be done. He didn't understand how integrated. If you want to have a convertible currency, if you want to be able to eat fruit in winter, if you want your citizens to be able to travel, if you want to have weapon systems that rely in any way on advanced technology rather than whatever comes out of the factories in Minsk, you are integrated into a world economy. And the people and the central banks that govern the major currencies have enormous power over you. I talked to a Soviet-born economist now at Stanford who coined a saying that you never fight with the people whose currencies you use to back up your own currency. And that sounded a bit of a mouthful. A reader helpfully abridged it. Never put your savings in someone else's mattress. That's what the Russians had done. And Putin thought that he could just reach into that mattress and take the savings out whenever he wanted to. And he got a rude surprise.
Well, having said that, let me do a quick follow-up with you. And that is the so-called SWIFT global financial system that Russia is a part of. Apparently, it's a bridge too far to kick them out. What do you think of that?
SWIFT is the least of it. SWIFT is a messaging system. SWIFT is a privately owned entity that allows banks to move money around. And if you've ever sent an international wire, you've relied on it. That is not what hit the Russians so hard. What hit them hard was the sanctioning by the central banks, the two big ones, the Fed and the European Central Bank, and the two next ones, the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan, that made Russia had $630 billion in reserves, 139 in physical gold in a vault in Moscow, and the rest claims on other central banks. Monday morning, those $630 billion of reserves were effectively worthless. And the result was the ruble ceased to be a real currency. A currency is something you can use to buy anything. Now, the Russians can still do bilateral barter with China or North Korea or whoever will do business with them, but they can't do business on world markets, and their currency doesn't buy anything on world markets anymore.
This is an excerpt from a publication called Unheard.com, published just a couple of days ago. Velina, I'm going to get you to react to this first. Here it goes. Even if the West can find ways to inflict serious economic damage on Russia, that still does not mean sanctions will work. To be truly effective, they must also change the Russian government's behavior. And this is where the logic of sanctions often breaks down. It is remarkably rare for Western policymakers to explain or even consider exactly how economic pain is supposed to translate into political gain. And the prospects in this particular case do not look promising. So says the writer Lee Jones. Do you think, Velina, that the sanctions, as biting as David has just described them, can actually change Putin's behavior?
No, absolutely not. I think that the Russian president has factored in the sanctions, and I think that he has factored in full-scale, most severe, worst-case scenario of sanctions. And this is the most worrisome element of the assessment, because even then, he actually decided to make such a move on Ukraine. And I think that it is really kind of a different world we are living in, and we should be a little bit of contrarian, because on the one side the West of course has introduced these severe sanctions, and rightly so. This was absolutely necessary to be done, but on the other side China has zero intentions to impose any sanctions on Russia. Russia is going to become even more dependent on the dragon bear, what I described as a systemic coordination between Moscow and Beijing in the most relevant strategic domains.
Although the Charter, of course, has rights that are laid out, there's not a right to work in a particular place. So if you don't meet the requirements for that place, then you're not going to be able to work there. So, for example, If long-term care nursing homes are noticing there was a lot of deaths earlier in the pandemic in regards to COVID, then if there is a vaccine, it seems that in order to preserve life, people are going to then say, okay, well, the nurses or anyone who works in the home have to be vaccinated. So in my view, looking directly at the charter, there's not a right necessarily that is being curtailed. It's simply what's happening is that if you're not meeting the current job requirements, then you just simply can't work there anymore.
Okay, Kara, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Tanya said. I think that there are complicating factors. You know, one of the things, especially when it came to the federal government's a mandate for their own employees, was that it was very broad. So we weren't talking about a group of employees that were dealing with, vulnerable populations. It applied to people even if they worked remotely. So that was hard to make out a sort of occupational health and safety justification. And so I think that there are questions about kind of the reasonableness of some of those requirements. But it is true, as Tanya says, that there isn't sort of a right to work in a particular place. And so I think certainly charter rights were implicated, but whether there was a violation is a lot harder to ascertain. And I think does depend a fair bit on kind of the specific details.
Okay, I'm going to get Paul to weigh in on this, in as much as we do have, of course, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it also spells out that these are not absolute rights. There are some nuances and boundaries that come with them. Help us understand that.
Yeah, well, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Steve, protect freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of speech and expression and association. You know, in the context, I guess we'll start obviously talking about the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. That means that, you know, although public streets and roads are primarily for traffic, they can, in some circumstances, be taken up by large groups in mass protests or demonstrations when people are protesting against issues involving the government or opposing the government. The question is, what is the limitation, or does someone have the right to block a road indefinitely, or in the case of Ottawa, block all of the downtown roads and blast horns that are at ear-splitting volumes day and night, and have trucks running 24 hours a day? So we do protect freedom of assembly and freedom of association, but the question is, when do those freedoms go too far to infringe on the rights of others, and what's reasonable limits in the circumstances?
Do a quick follow-up. You asked the question, do people have those freedoms? What's your answer?
Yes, absolutely. I'm usually protecting protesters. I've acted on cases protecting people who are striking or engaging in protests. I've testified in Parliament about the right to protest, and that when people come together to protest, Steve, it doesn't matter what their issue is. I think we need to see that as a civic good. When people are organizing politically, that demonstrates the strength of our democracy. So when I see a protest, even if I disagree with what they're protesting, I generally will say that's a great thing, and is protected by our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Given that this pandemic is almost 2 years old, certainly enough time to start looking back and learning some lessons. And to that end, I want to start by just reading this excerpt from the Washington Post science and politics writer, Joel Aschenbach, who wrote the following. Officials with the World Health Organization could have been faster to declare a public health emergency of international concern. They punted on that on January 23, 2020, citing the absence of confirmed cases of human-to-human transmission outside of China. A week later, they acknowledged the obvious. We were all in trouble. At that point, the virus had seeded itself in 18 countries. Okay, Lawrence Gostin, get us started here. Could our global health institutions have prevented much of what we have experienced over the past 2 years, in your view?
Probably not. Having said that, I do think that China misled the World Health Organization, saying that there was not human-to-human transmission when there clearly was widespread community transmission. And at the same time, I think the WHO amplified that incorrectly. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned. It was our only shot to keep this epidemic under control, but probably we would have still ended up in the place we are now because it's a fast-moving respiratory virus.
Joanne Liu, what's your view on that?
Well, I think that we got a little bit, I would say, sidetracked by some of the geopolitical tension back then. That's one thing. And the other thing is, as well, is there might be some delay in terms of calling for public health emergency of international concern. But I guess the biggest delay that happened at the beginning of this pandemic is what we call the last month of February, when we declared the public health emergency of the international concern, and very few countries actually started to take any measure about, I would say, responding to this epidemic. And so therefore, nothing happened. So last month of February, and then finally declaration of a pandemic on March 11th.
Mario Passamine, what's your view?
I think it could have gone much, much better. I think the great failure of the WHO and our own public health agencies is that between SARS-1 and the advent of the pandemic, we had a golden era of research into aerosol transmission that revolutionized how we understand that respiratory diseases are spread. But all that knowledge, all that information was ignored by the agencies leading up to COVID. And then once an emergency was declared, they were so slow in implementing airborne mitigation measures. So I think that's a real institutional failure, and things could have gone much, much better.
If we got the Public Health Agency of Canada as a result of SARS, when the coronavirus hit, we're talking now either December, or I guess January 2020, and then March it's official, what was its mission, or what should its mission have been in those earliest of days, given that it was now dealing with a global pandemic?
Well, it decided right from the start that this was not an airborne disease. It ruled that out. It should have kept an open mind. And there was, during that time, there were Chinese scientists and doctors who were writing articles in the Lancet saying, we believe this is airborne. We have gone to airborne precautions. You should consider it too. There was also the fact that China on January 20th had itself gone to airborne precautions and deciding that the large droplet precautions that the WHO was recommending were no longer effective. But the Public Health Agency of Canada ignored all that and decided that this was not an airborne disease, and when they should have kept an open mind. And I think that was just a very destructive, troubling decision that has really hampered our response. And I think it's led to things like lockdowns being the only effective tool, when in fact we had many, many other tools that we could have used and should have used.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.